In this lesson, we're going to dive a bit deeper into bevels because they're a really important part of the hard surface modeling workflow. All edges in computer graphics are razor sharp by default, and so it's often helpful to give them a chamfer or a fillet so that the light can glint off of them in a pleasing way and really help to give the shape of the object some definition. This is great for both stylized and realistic objects. We've already talked about how to add bevels in edit mode by going into edit mode and selecting an edge, and just using the hotkey Control-B. Here I can scroll up or down to increase or decrease the amount of cuts, and in the status bar I have a whole lot of different options. But even if that's a little bit too much to pay attention to while I'm editing the bevel, I can also just left click to confirm, and then edit any of those same settings over in the redo panel over on the bottom left. All of these same settings can also be found in the bevel modifier, so let's take a look at that now. I'll go to object mode, over to modifiers, and add modifier, and this time I'll just type in bevel. By the way, I have my wireframes on so you can see the edges of the object even in object mode by going to overlay and turning on wireframe here. The first option is the width type, and this is something that I'd like to demonstrate on a different object. So I'll enable this wedge collection, and I'll provide this file in the downloads if you want to follow along with it. But I'll just select our object here, and I have two objects directly on top of each other. I have one that's the exact same mesh data, but it's a wireframe and there's no bevel modifier. And then there's this solid object with a bevel modifier, so we can directly compare. I'll go into front view here and zoom in really close to this top corner so that we can compare these different width types. So the first is offset, and if I take my measure tool from the toolbar and just click and drag, you can see that the distance from the original point down to the new one along that edge is about 0.1. So when the width type is set to offset, that's the length that it's calculating. I'll hit X to delete that measure, and then let's switch over to width, and this one is going to instead measure the width of the face. If I do that, you can see that that's, again, about 0.1. The next one is depth, and that's going to measure the distance from the original point down to the surface. Lastly, we have a percent, which is just a percentage of the whole on either side. So we can't go past 50 if all edges are beveled. And lastly, we have absolute, which is very similar to offset, but it's going to be even on both sides. And we can see that a bit better here at the front. If I switch this over to offset, you can see we have a much wider and slightly more consistent bevel coming up through here towards the front. But if I switch this to absolute, we're going to get a little bit more warping, but the actual distance from the new edge to the old one is going to be constrained to exactly equal 0.1. So oftentimes I'll just leave this as offset, but some of the others can definitely come in handy as well. Underneath the amount and the segments, we have our limit method to determine which edges are actually getting beveled. If I set this to 0, then every single edge is going to be beveled as long as it has some sort of angle. You can see that these edges on flat faces aren't getting beveled, but all of these with just even a tiny bit of angle will be beveled. And I can increase this to whatever I need to. Now you can also set this to none so that every single edge gets beveled no matter what, or you can set this to weight and do that manually in edit mode just like we've looked at before. Here I'll tab into edit mode and select an edge, and over in the sidebar, increase the bevel weight. The advantage of doing things this way is that you can add variable bevel weights, such that some are going to be a little bit thicker than others. If I set that to 0.5, it'll be exactly half of the offset of the first one. You can also set this to vertex group, which I don't often use because vertex groups and edges don't necessarily mix super well. For example, if I wanted to bevel this edge, that one, and that one, if I do that with vertex select mode, then it's going to select those entire faces, and these edges are going to get beveled as well because they're also part of the vertex group, which includes those faces. So often I just stick to working with weight, and hopefully sometime in the future we'll be able to use custom edge attributes, but for now, often just setting this to angle or weight is pretty good. This corner up here is a good example of where being really specific about which edges get beveled might come in handy. This actually looks pretty good as is, but if we were to bevel this edge as well, let's say I lower the angle such that that pops into existence, we might not like this pinching that could happen resulting from this triangle here, resulting from this new triangle that's been created. So the advantage of setting things to weight, which I'll just do a select and sharp edges. Let's go down to about 20-ish, so that edge also gets selected. Control E and mark sharp. And then let's increase the mean bevel weight all the way to 1. And then notice how we can also Alt left click to select this edge loop that goes all the way around. And even though it's on a completely flat surface, I can still bevel it and really change how that intersection looks. So we could try beveling this edge as well and see if it looks better or worse. In this case, I think beveling that looks significantly worse, so I'll take that down. But for this one, it might be useful to have a quad in that area instead of a triangle, so I might leave that beveled. All of these types of decisions are highly specific to your project and what it is that you're trying to do with this object, so it's good to have that flexibility if you need it. For most basic objects though, sticking to the default of angle is usually just fine. I'll go ahead and hide our wire object since we don't need it for comparison anymore, and then let's take a look at the profile. This really only takes effect if we have more than one segment, so let's crank that up a bit. Let's go to 10, and then change the shape. Here we can make it concave or convex. If we set it all the way to 1, then we can get a perfect right angle, which we'll see come in handy later on in the course when we talk about the subdivision surface modifier and sharpening it up. We can also set this to custom and draw our own profile curve here in the modifier. This can be really useful when making things like cabinets or picture frames that are a little bit more complex, but still have a bevel that wraps all the way around. Mostly though, I'll set it to super ellipse, and the default value of 0.5 is usually pretty good. Under geometry, we can change how the bevels intersect with each other. We have them for both concave and convex areas. So just really quick, let's go into edit mode, and I'll take one of these faces here. I to inset, E to extrude, and that way we have both a concave and convex intersection to look at. For the outer one, we can set that to patch. That's going to round that out really well, and also add in a grid of quads. If you want, you can set this to arc, which is also nice and rounded, but we don't have that grid of quads extending out towards the point, which might be useful or not depending on your situation. For the inner intersections, we can also set that to arc, and when you do that, we need to manually set a spread value just to see how big these patches should be. This is a really great all-quad solution in some areas, but you can see it also makes a mess in other areas, so I don't tend to use it too often. For inner, sharp is usually pretty good. Also for intersections, we can use cutoff, and there we don't actually get any intersections at all, and the use case for that is if we have a custom profile. That can often look a lot better than if we have that as a grid fill, which just gives us a really mushy kind of blend in between. So if you have a custom profile, it's often better to set that to cutoff. Clamp overlap we already talked about, but this is a super important one because if you have it on and your edges are too close together, then it can look like your bevel isn't working. For example, if I take my face here and let's move it along its normal by switching my orientation to normal, pulling it up along the Z. If I pull this too close to the top edge and have clamp overlap turned on, you can see this changes the width of the bevel all the way around the object. So if you don't want that, then turn clamp overlap off. Loop slide is also a helpful option. Here it's mostly making a difference over in this bottom left area, but it's turning on and off the trade-off of having the edges better align with the original edges versus having an exactly even width. So with loop slide enabled, then you can see we have some variable widths here, where this top bevel is a bit skinnier than this bottom one, and if we turn that off, then those are going to be nice and even. But on some more complex geometry, things might not line up with the original object quite as well. And lastly, we have this shading tab, which has a really helpful option, which is harden normals. I'll go ahead and turn off my wireframes though, so we can actually see this. Right now this object is flat shaded, but if I right click and shade smooth, then you can see that this looks pretty good, but we're getting some artifacts. I don't know how easy this is to see on the screen, but we're getting a little bit of horizontal pinching along what should be a flat surface. Now I could right click and shade auto smooth here, but this isn't going to be super helpful because our bevels have introduced a bunch of really small angles in between all of these faces And so auto smooth isn't going to sharpen up anything. Well, if I turn on harden normals, then it's going to override whatever shading I have previously set and do something that's really similar to what the weighted normal modifier did that we looked at in the last video, where it keeps the original flat faces flat and shifts that smooth blend all the way over to the newly beveled edges. So this is a really helpful option that I often have turned on. It only affects the newly beveled edges though, so the rest of the mesh will use whatever you had set previously. Whether this works just fine on its own or whether you should add a weighted normal modifier is something that you can try for yourself if you're not getting exactly the results that you want. For the most part though, turning this on is often an instant fix when you're using smooth shading. Speaking of shading though, there's also one other method of beveling that I want to show you that doesn't involve altering the geometry at all. Here I'll duplicate this object and move it along the y-axis and remove the bevel modifier. Then I'll right click and shade auto smooth to smooth out those low angles. For this type of bevel, we're going to head over to the shading workspace. We'll talk about the shader editor and nodes a lot more in the fundamentals of materials and shading and also the fundamentals of textures, so it's not something we can get into in depth here. But the controls for navigating the shader editor are largely the same as in the 3D view. So you can middle mouse button and drag to move around, scroll to zoom in or out, and left click on nodes to select them, and left click and drag to move them around. It's pretty intuitive, but what we want to do here is plug a bevel into the normal of our shader. And just like when we were talking about the mesh normals being the direction that the faces are pointing, plugging a different normal into our shader tells the render engine to reflect or refract light at a slightly different angle than the surface that's actually there. So we can do a lot of trickery with the normal in the shader editor. Here, I'll just add a bevel by dragging out from the normal until we get the little plus icon, release, and that'll bring up a search, and I'll just type in bevel. Hit enter, and now we've attached a bevel node to that normal. Now it's not going to appear to do anything, and that's because we're using Eevee currently. So let's go over to our render properties, which is the top camera icon tab that's in the properties editor, and let's switch our render engine from Eevee to Cycles. Eevee being the fast real-time engine, and Cycles being the more powerful path tracing engine. Then we can switch our viewport from material preview over to rendered, and now we can see that it is in fact working, but it's a bit hard to see without much going on in the background for the object to reflect. So let's go over to the shading dropdown, and under scene world, I'll uncheck that so that we can use one of our preview spheres, and you can pick whichever one of these you'd like. I'll go ahead and pick that first one, and then I'll just zoom out a bit. Then I'll also switch this over to GPU rendering so it renders a bit faster. Okay, now if I increase the radius on my bevel node, then we'll get a wider bevel. You can tell that it's attempting to round the corners here, but it's not super convincing. One thing that we can do is increase the samples. This is going to make it render a bit slower, but it's often worth it for the quality. So I'll bump this up all the way to 8 and turn back down the radius so it's a bit more subtle. I'll also increase the metallic value all the way to 1 and lower the roughness just so that we can see this a bit better. Also, so we can have a direct comparison with this one on the left, I'll select the object on the left, and right now these are sharing the same material because I duplicated them. So what I'll do is I'll just go ahead and click the 2 in the shader editor to make this a different material, and take this bevel node and delete it. So now this one does not have a bevel node, and this one does, and we can see the difference in quality between them. Obviously, when you zoom up close, it's no contest. The object on the left looks so much more clean and crisp, but when you zoom out really far, it's pretty hard to tell the difference. So using the bevel node in the shader editor is good for really small bevels, not so much for ones up close. If we were to decrease the radius to something quite slight, let's say like 0.02, then this actually looks pretty good. And the difference of before and after is that we get that nice slight glint all the way along that edge, and it really helps to define the shape. Another thing that's cool about this is that in order to get a bevel, your mesh doesn't actually have to be connected to other parts of the mesh. For example, if I add a sphere here, which is something that would be traditionally pretty hard to combine with a complex surface, I'll just put it on the corner over here. And if I give that the same material, I'll just call this material bevel. And let's use the drop down here and assign that bevel material to the sphere. I'll also right click and shade smooth. Then if we join these two objects together such that they're the same object and share the same material, then that intersection between them will also be beveled, even though there's no actual connection in the geometry. So let's go to Object and Join. And now we can see a nice shaded bevel right in there. This would be pretty difficult to achieve with geometry, and it allows us to very quickly, I'll hit Control L to select the sphere by itself. It allows us to adjust our geometry really easily and keeps things nice and flexible. Now I'll head back to my layout workspace here, and the main question that you probably have is when to use each type of bevel. A good rule of thumb is to use bevels in edit mode for really larger bevels and for areas that you want to continue building off of, whereas the bevel modifier is great for medium to smaller size bevels that apply to most if not all of the object. Then the bevel node over in the shader editor is best for those really small and finishing touches type bevels, and where you want to create beveled intersections without actually connecting the geometry. Like I mentioned before, this bevel shader does not work in Eevee, so if you switch over from Cycles to Eevee, then we're not going to get that effect. But you can bake the bevel into a normal map for use in Eevee or a game engine or anywhere else, but that's a much bigger topic for another day. For now, just try each of the 3 types of bevels, and I'll see you in the next lesson.